Alav Facebook. Even though the title's funny. Woman and Torah Study. This is an important subject, especially for our times. What is the concept? What is the law when it comes to, or how do we go about teaching women Torah? Should women be taught Torah? Should they be learning more than men? What is the general outline when it comes to women and Torah study? Now, why did I choose this subject today? The reason why I chose this subject today is because this concept comes out before the Torah is even given. So to start us off today, we're going to go straight into our notes. Joe, you've already taken the joke for the day while we're not online. I'll go straight into the notes. I want to show you something. So this week's portion, we talk about the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And when we discuss, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Achodesh HaShlishi?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So we're told in this week's portion that the Jewish people arrived on Mount Sinai. Now, I was hoping to start off with a discussion about the giving of the Torah in general, and then get onto the topic at hand, which is women and Torah study. But I thought that prior to doing that, it would be ideal to first go on to my main topic for tonight, which is women and Torah study, and if we have time, to further delve into the episodes and what occurred around the giving of the Torah from a Hasidic perspective. So we're going to start with actually where is it? Oh, I lost the place. Sorry. Oh, thank you. I had it. Sorry. Okay, so let's just start. The Jewish people have just left Mount Sinai. Of course, the last couple of weeks we've just been discussing the exodus from Egypt and Yitzit Mitzrayim, that culminates ultimately in the splitting of the sea, which was last week. That was the focus of our discussion last week. But the truth is that the exodus was there. We're told, V'otzeti, that I'll take you out of Egypt and then you will serve me on the mountain, which is telling us that the ultimate purpose of the Jewish people leaving Egypt was really not for no purpose in and of itself, but ultimately for the Jewish people to receive the Torah, which is the ultimate purpose of all of creation. Why we were created is that there should be a Jewish nation that should go down Egypt, and then that should be the preparation for them receiving the Torah, and the Jewish people fulfilling the Torah is a major element in creation. So, the Torah has just come from the episode of Yitro, and we'll talk about maybe later why that's important. Why the Torah starts. This is in Parshat Yitro, which Yitro is Moshe's father-in-law, and he talks about appointing judges. But in the fourth call-up, which is tomorrow's call-up, once again, it talks about when the Jewish people arrived in the Sinai desert. When did they arrive there? 43 days after leaving Egypt, which was on Rosh Chodesh of Sivan. Chodesh HaShlishi. Once again, everything in Judaism is significant. They left in which month? First month, which was the month of Nisan. And they now are they have the whole of Iyar, so they spent the whole of the second half of Nisan, the whole of Iyar. That's already 43 days, 6 days. How long is it? It's about 43 days that they've been counting, and they are now counting down the days till they're receiving the Torah. So it's going to be a total of 49 days. And on the 50th day, in the morning, they're going to receive. So they now come to their destination. B'chodesh hashlishi, on the third day, in the third month, the Jewish people left Egypt. By Yom Hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. On this day, what's this day? The Rosh Chodesh. They came. Now says the pasuk further, V'yisum Refidim, they came from the place called Refidim, V'yaba'u midbar Sinai, and they camped in Midbar Sinai, in the Sinai desert. V'yichanu ba'midbar, and they dwelled in the desert. Then here's the important words, preparational words for giving the Torah. V'yichan sham Yisrael neged ahar, and we're told that the Jewish people dwelt there opposite the mountain. Now I'm going to come back to this, please God, later on in the shir. These words, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, these become very important, very central to Jewish practice, this particular line. So we're told that then, when they arrived, Moshe goes up to God, Allah. So where does he go? He goes up Mount Sinai. God calls him from the mountain, saying, now this is where we'll be coming to our discussion, Ko tomar lebeit Yaakov v'taged livnei Yisrael. This is what you should say to the house of Jacob, and you should tell over to the children of Israel. Who are the children of Israel, and who is Beit Yaakov? Why does it repeat? The house of Jacob and the sons of Israel. Who are these two groups?
Same people.
Very good. So why say twice? If it's the same people, why are we doing it twice? Okay, so let's look at Rashi. I didn't want to show us Rashi before we actually look at it. So it says Rashi. Moshe Allah. When did Moshe go up? The second day when they arrived. V'chol aliyotav b'ashkema hayu. And whenever he went up early in the morning at dawn. Shenemar v'yashke Moshe b'boker, like it says that Moshe woke up early in the morning. Kotamar, so you should say. B'loshen hazeh or cheseder hazeh. In this language and in this order. What's this language? He says, Leveit Yaakov. Who is Beit Yaakov? So the question is, it says Beit Yaakov and said Taged Livnei Yisrael. He says, Eilu Hanoshim. These are referring to the woman. Tomar lehem b'lashon raka. Tell them in a soft spoken, gentle way of speaking. V'taged livnei Yisrael, and then say to the children of Israel. What do you tell? Who's that? That's the Ayin Shim v'diktuim perish ezrachim. Dvarim hakoshim kegidim. He told them the harsh concept of punishments and things like that. Things that are harsh, as he says, as wormwood, is what he translated over here. So, what's going on over here? What is pasuk telling us? What does he want to tell us? We're about to receive the Torah. Moshe comes down to Mount Sinai, and God tells him something you need. Okay, you're going to be receiving the Torah. I want you to prepare. What do you have got to do to prepare? Tomar says Rashi. What is wrong? Say in a soft, gentle way to who? To the Beit Yaakov. To Beit Yaakov, say one way, and Taged, which is generally considered a harsh way of speaking, is to who? To the men. So Beit Yaakov, we're supposed to speak softly, and to the men you're supposed to speak harshly. At least that's the way it seems. But what I want to focus on is who came first. Who was the first one that God said to tell the Jewish people about the Torah? The first one to find out about this, he's going to tell them, is first tell the woman. So we often think about the concept of the giving of Torah and Torah study, and we say, well, Torah study is for men, not necessarily for women. But here we're seeing that at the very start, when the Torah was first given, when he gives the commandment, he arrives at the place to give you the Torah, what does he say? He says, first tell the woman, and then tell the man. The woman come first. So why are the women being told first? Yes, Joe, why are you smiling?
I'm just thinking, we're talking about families, couples. If the woman doesn't agree, nothing else is going to happen.
Good point. Interesting.
They need to be teaching their household, their kids.
Very good. So okay, good. So the answer to that is exactly as both of you have said. More directly, I've seen Noach's answer from the Rebbe, that he says that the women come first. We often think that there's an obligation to study Torah. The obligation to study Torah is that we actually have a defined obligation. It's defined what that obligation is. What's the definition of the obligation for a male to study Torah? Says Maimonides, it's one chapter in the morning and one chapter in the evening. That's everybody is obligated to learn something every day, some element of Torah. Who does that apply to? It only applies to men. Women are not obligated to study Torah. So you might say that if women are not obligated to study Torah, then maybe we shouldn't bother teaching them the Torah. Maybe don't worry about it. Let other people study the Torah. Let the men study the Torah. So the answer, says the Rebbe, comes and tells us, no, it doesn't mean that they're not that they shouldn't learn the Torah. Not only that, the Torah was given first to them before the men. They have to learn the Torah. The difference is that there's two faults. We can't make it a defined obligation for a woman to study Torah for several reasons. Number one, because she's too busy. If you're going to say you have to study an hour of Torah in the morning, or whatever it is, a few moments of Torah in the morning and a few moments in the evening, what's she going to do with her children while she's doing that? What happens if she needs to go get her children, take care of her children? What happens if she has to be cooking dinner? What happens if it takes her a whole day to cook dinner? So for a man, you could answer the same thing. The answer is the man, his main job, at least historically, has been... Hi, Irene.
Hi, sorry we're late.
No, Irene.
Sorry.
All good. Good to see you. So, a man, in normal circumstances, a woman is the one that's preparing the meal, that she's taking care of the kids. I wouldn't say normal, but this is the way it's been. And she is running the house. And therefore, to expect her to also go and study Torah is not something that is going to always be possible. So therefore, the Torah makes a blanket rule that women don't have a defined obligation. Men have a defined obligation of what they have to study. They're supposed to study whenever they can, but at the minimum, we're supposed to study once in the morning and once in the evening. And actually, the rabbis inserted parts of the davening to that obligation. So part of davening actually includes Torah study, like we have in the beginning, Ezehu Makom Shel Zavachim. It goes through all these sacrifices. A chapter of Mishnah. It says actually Perek Echod, one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. So the same concept applies with many, many laws that are time bound. So we know that generally the Torah was given to all Jewish people to a certain degree equally. However, women and men have a few differences. Women are not obligated to do positive commandments that are time bound if they don't have a negative commandment attached to them. What that means is, for example, are women obligated to keep Shabbat? Are women obligated to keep Shabbat? Yes. Why? It's a time-bound mitzvah. In other words, it comes once a week at a particular time. So why would a woman be obligated to keep Shabbat if it's a time-bound mitzvah? We just said that women are not obligated to fulfill time-bound mitzvahs generally. Let me ask you another question. Are women obligated to put on tefillin? No. Why not?
You have to
Because
do it in the morning by a certain time. They might not have
Because
time.
it has a specific time to it. That's right. It's supposed to be done during the daytime and ideally in the morning. That's right. So why are women obligated in the mitzvah of Shabbos, but they're not obligated in the mitzvah of tefillin? The reason is because Shabbos has a negative. There's a double. It's called a aseh and a lav.
That's right.
Right. What that means is that there's two commandments. There's two elements to it. There's you shall keep Shabbos, and there is lo yisaseh kol malacha. Don't do any work. They're obligated in all negative commandments, all don'ts. You know, it reminds me, my kids are already struggling with this whole COVID concept. I don't understand why when somebody comes back with COVID, we call them that's a positive thing. And when they come back with a test that says that they don't have COVID, that means that it's negative. They just can't get it. It should be, you're positive, you're good. So obviously getting COVID must be positive. Anyway, sorry, just to kind of wake me up. So we have positive and negative commandments. We have do's and don'ts. Women are obligated in all don'ts, in all don't do's. So whether it depends, it's time bound or not. So therefore, all chagim, there's both elements to it. So when we say 613 mitzvot, is it 613 individual mitzvot? Not necessarily. Sometimes you can have one mitzvah, like Shabbos has several mitzvahs related to it. And thousands of halachot. Right? There's thousands of halachot related just to Shabbos. One mitzvah. But really, mitzvah of Shabbos, the Torah has numerous elements to it. It has do not make a fire, do not go leave your place, do not do work, keep the Shabbos holy, guard the Shabbos, keep the Shabbos, remember the Shabbos. So there's a whole bunch of elements to Shabbos. But all the individual laws are not necessarily there. So anytime there's a positive and a negative, then woman will be obligated. So Shabbos, Yom Tov. But if it only has the positive, hey Yochanan, welcome, good to see you. If it only has the negative, if it only has the positive, it only, for example, tefillin, there's a mitzvah in the Shema. We have a mitzvah, ukshartem le'ot al yadecha. I want you to do something. That you should tie it for a sign on your arm, and for a totafot between your eyes on your head. A sign
Also
between.
for learning Torah.
So
For teaching your kids Torah, that's from the Shema too.
right, so a woman obligated in it.
Well, it's got the positive and negative, because it says V'shinantam levanecha v'dibart bam, ve'im lo ta'asu is the negative. Sorry, you have to translate it. But so they're both. There's a do and a don't. So
Yeah, I'm
women
not sure
should be
about the
obligated.
negative when it comes to Torah study.
Ve'im lo ta'asu et advarim ha'ele, etc.
That's the mitzvah. That's not im lo yidilma. Vishinantam is to learn. So the
Yes, so the im lo ta'asu does not apply to the V'shinantam as well.
no, it's not talking about Torah study.
Okay.
Okay, you're talking about the second part, the second portion of the Shema. Okay, so let me
That's right.
try to make some sense of what you're saying. Tell me what I'm saying, if I'm understanding it correctly. So where do we have the obligation? So getting back to our discussion at that point, so tefillin is only a positive, therefore women are exempt, right? Where do we find the main? Tefillin is repeated several times in the Torah, the obligation for tefillin. We actually had it at the end of last week's portion, right? When we spoke about the Petarechem, the firstborn animal, okay, and it's a remembrance of Israel. So tefillin is there to remind us of the Exodus. So we have the obligation to put on tefillin as a positive commandment. But the main place that we have the obligation, or the most famous, is in the first paragraph of the Shema and the second paragraph of the Shema. So if we were to go through the Shema, we have Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the belief in one God. We have obligated to love Hashem. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, with all your heart and your soul. Then it goes, what's the next commandment? Vishinantam levanecha. You have to teach your children. What does that teach us? Two things. Number one, that we're obligated to study Torah when? Just like the Shema. It's talking about two things. It's talking about the Shema and Torah study. But it's positive commandments. Men have a positive commandment to study Torah twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. And if you do the prayers, you generally will fulfill that to a certain degree, at least if you're understanding something, if you do the full prayer. But it's about learning something in the morning and something in the evening, and saying the Shema in the morning and the evening. But there's no negative one. So Noach was saying, what about the second paragraph of Shema? When you look, it says, V'haya im Shema tishma'u. I'm sorry, I don't have it opened on the screen. It would be easy if I did.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it says, V'haya im Shema tishma'u. If you'll listen, El mitzvotai, to my commandments, Asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom, that I am commanding you today. So it's a general concept about listening. There's no particular one. I don't know of any negative one of if you don't learn. I only know of a positive when it comes to Torah learning. And that's why women don't have the obligation, but they have still the, I would say, it's not a mitzvah, it's not a mitzvah obligation, but it's a requirement. But how do we know that from our portion? Because when it comes to the giving of the Torah, when God tells them about the Torah, about the giving of the Torah they're about to receive, and how they're supposed to behave around the concept of Torah, and keep the mitzvahs of the Torah, and study the Torah in general, who's that given to? First the woman and then the men. And then the Rebbe learns something remarkable from this. He says, there's a few things we learn. First of all, when it talks about telling the woman, by the way, Beit Yaakov is several times the Torah referred to the woman as Beit Yaakov, and that's why one of the big female school franchises around the world, not in the Chabad world, but in the like the Litvish world in general, is a branch of girls' schools called Beit Yaakov, the house of Jacob. Why? Because of this name given to the community of the woman in the Torah. They're referred to as Beit Yaakov. So, why is the obligation given to the woman first? Or why is not the obligation, why is the precedence? Why are women given precedence when it comes to Torah study in this area? So the answer to this question is, the Rebbe explains, like Noach was saying. He said earlier, because the women were told, the one hand, we can't give them an obligation. Why? Because they're too busy in the house. They're too busy taking care of kids. They're too busy feeding and breastfeeding and having babies and cooking, whatever else they're doing. So you can't give them a time-bound commandment. Because many women, for some of the time, won't be able to do it. So therefore, you can't say do it now. But what happens when those times when they're not busy? What should they be doing? They should be studying. But it's not a defined obligation. But their obligation or their requirement to study Torah in a way is even more important. Because in Judaism, the ultimate focus is on the children, tells us the Rebbe. And therefore, if the ones that are going to be having that interaction with the children and teaching the children right at the beginning is going to be the woman, then they have to know the Torah. They have to be able to cultivate within in their children that love for God, love for Judaism, and for the Torah. And that's a requirement of the woman.
Rabbi, the mitzvah of Veshinantam Levanecha, I've always thought of that as being aimed at the men. So is it actually aimed at both?
No, it's that is it. So that's 100%. That's the obligation. You're correct. The obligation of teaching your children actually falls on the men. But the one that practically does it without, in other words, the one that does, I don't know what the terminology I'm looking for. When a woman teaches, a woman doesn't teach because they say, oh, this is what it says in the Torah, learn this verse from the Torah. A woman teaches by living, by example.
By example, yep.
So the woman's obligation, first of all, the woman's running the house. So there's a concept in Torah is that we don't have to study Torah with women. As a matter of fact, in the old days, the level of Torah study within women's schools was very limited. And one of the big changes that happened was actually largely because of the school called the Bet Yaakov school, and the Rebbe pushed that women in women's schools should be learning Torah just as much as men, and sometimes even more. Maybe they don't have to learn like the Talmud, where they have to start delving into all the laws and how it comes about. If that's what they want to do, for sure. But that's not. But when you're talking about practical law, in a certain way, the woman's requirement to know practical law is more important than the man's requirement. Because if the woman doesn't know how to have a kosher house, or how to take care of kids, or how to daven with their kids, then what's the upbringing going to be for their children? So that's why the Rebbe made a major change. Now, I was looking for today, prior to the shir, I was looking for a video which I could not find. There's the Belzer Rebbe, who's one of the great Rebbes of the past generation. His father was a Holocaust survivor who managed to escape and lost almost all of his Hasidim, but rebuilt his community after the war. Whose father was a very, very special person. But anyway, the son once came to visit the Rebbe, the previous Belzer Rebbe. It's now the next generation Rebbe. And he came to visit the Rebbe. And the Rebbe asked him, do you study Torah? Do you teach the girls in your Belzer schools? Are you teaching them Torah properly? And he said there's certain passages within the Talmud that seem to imply that we shouldn't overdo it with teaching Torah to the two women. What's the line that he's referring to? It says in the Talmud that a person that teaches Torah to his daughters, it's as if he's teaching them foolishness. So he says, it seems to be saying in the Talmud we shouldn't be teaching them. So the Rebbe answered, he said, maybe in the old days, when women never had the opportunity to study properly, they were so busy with running the household and taking care of kids, and had to, they had to grind their bread and pluck the feathers off the sheep and skin the animals just to get a meal. It took a whole day literally to make a meal. Then maybe if then you would teach a drop of Torah, they would have misconstrued it, could have taken it out of proportion. But today's day and age, where women could buy ready-made meals, and many women have plenty of time to study Torah. Not only that, they're studying many other things. Not only is it not considered foolishness, but on the other hand, they could even surpass men in their level of Torah study, and it's a much more greater requirement. Today, it's an absolute requirement. So in other words, in old days, the referral was teach the woman what they have to know, and anything and all the stories. But if you're going to start getting into, because you don't have, so this was misunderstood. So some people said, women maybe aren't, maybe the Talmud is coming to say that women aren't smart enough to study the Torah, that therefore we shouldn't teach women Torah. The Rebbe said, no, that's not what it meant. It never meant that. It meant that women were so busy with their duties most of the time that they never had time to delve into the Torah, and therefore it could have come across to them or by them or from them as not being fully understood. But in an age where women do have the time and they are being educated, the first and foremost element that they have to be educated in is in Torah study. And not only that, they have the abilities to definitely surpass men in the Torah study. By the way, we know that women have the ability to definitely surpass men when it comes to studying. It's not even a question. But the question was the way women were or from the understanding of Judaism, the obligation for women, their first and foremost obligation was to building their families. And that meant that there was going to be times that women simply would not have had time at all. And I'm sure that in the old days there would have been times that women never had time. They were always, as I said, sometimes it took a full day to make a meal, even if you didn't have little children to worry about. And that's why women never had the obligation to put on tefillin, because it was a time-bound mitzvah. They don't have the obligation to daven with the minyan and to go to shul. And most of the time in olden days shuls, most old shuls didn't have a women's section even. Because women were so busy with what they had to do, they never had the opportunity to have to come to shul, to study. It just simply wasn't a possibility. But we know that when there was that possibility, it was done. We know famously Rashi learnt with his daughters a huge amount. The Alter Rebbe, who is the founder of the Hasidic movement, we know that his mother and his grandmother were very, very big Torah giants. As a matter of fact, I think the story is told of the Alter Rebbe. I believe it's his grandmother. She was a huge Torah scholar. And at that time it was looked at as unbecoming, so to speak, for women to be scholars, at least in the non-Hasidic styled circles. If you weren't connected to the Baal Shem Tov, it was like looked down upon for women to sit and study, as I say, because of the misunderstanding of the Talmud. That's the way I understand it, at least. And she got married to a very learned man, but she never told him that she knew how to study, that she was a scholar, because she was concerned that he wouldn't approve of her Torah study. So she would study when he was out at work and when he wasn't in the home. So her father was once walking, and it was a Shabbos, and a halachic question came up while they were walking. I think somebody's strap broke and they couldn't carry it on Shabbos. I don't remember the exact question, but it's recorded. The previous Rebbe writes it down in his book, Memoirs, I believe. And she's walking with her father and her husband and a few other men and people, like a crowd of people walking somewhere on Shabbos. And this halachic question comes up and they start discussing it. And her father says, hold on a second, we have the halachic authority over you. My daughter, she's a great halachic authority. Let her say what the halacha is. And she got all embarrassed because she kept the secret from her husband, and she knew that her husband didn't approve. So she kind of tried to not answer the question. She certainly knew the answer. Eventually her father pushed her and she said the answer, and her husband was not very impressed, because in his understanding women didn't learn. But funnily enough, these women were the parents, the mothers and the grandmothers of some of the greatest scholars, and often those women knew more Torah than most Torah scholars at the time, without a doubt. Okay, so the story goes on, and how she kept him, and then she started teaching her daughter in private when her husband was away, because the daughter knew that she was a great scholar. So we know that it was definitely something that was done. Only that the Alter Rebbe, talking about the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement 250 years ago, he taught a novel style of Torah study, which is till this day considered one of the most revolutionary approaches to Torah study, the Hasidic Chabad approach. He sometimes would say Hasidic Torah discourses only for his daughters, and only his daughters were allowed to listen in. And sometimes his son, who was his successor, the Mittler Rebbe, the next Rebbe, was so desperate to hear another discourse, he would go to his sisters and say, convince our father to teach you something so that I can listen through the door. So it seems as though the real scholars did not believe in this concept of not teaching Torah to their wives and their daughters, like we know. As I said, Rashi certainly taught, and many other great scholars. I believe it was, I can't go through all the scholars and say exactly who learned and who didn't, but I would think that the real scholars really taught their daughters that they didn't know how to learn, at least if they would have to find the time for that. Okay, so getting back on topic. Sorry, would anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I just want to add, Rabbi, and it's definitely on topic. A book called Sena Urena.
Yes.
I mean, I could talk about it, but you may have a view on that.
Yeah, no, go ahead. What did you want to say?
Well, my late grandmother, she was known as a Torah scholar. And when we went through her books, there was a copy of Sena Urena there with commentary. And that encouraged me to do a bit more research on it. Her own story was an awkward. She grew up with the Belzer in Sheneva, in that part of Poland, and because she lost her parents very early in life, tragically, she was actually brought up by her grandfather, and she told us that. It was frowned upon for her to learn Torah. Normally, if she had parents, she would have been strongly discouraged from learning. But her grandfather took a different view. He basically said, well, there's no one left to teach you. I'll teach you.
Oh, wow. Amazing. But I think Sena Urena, I don't know much about the actual book, but I know that it was a book that was very popular amongst women because it was especially written for people that knew basics but hadn't had a yeshiva education. So therefore they would be able to learn all these concepts without those years in yeshiva. Women weren't sent away from home to go and study in yeshiva. Today's day and age, we have a seminary program where we send women away to study for a year or two. But in those days, that was unheard of. Women stayed next to their mother and learned how to, all their requirements, and that was what they studied, and they learned the laws that they had to know, often from their mothers.
So Sena Urena, the purpose of the book, exactly, it was for women who were not offered the opportunity to study Torah, and because the community frowned on that, somehow Sena Urena was accepted as a book that the women could study without being ostracized, and so they could learn Torah from a different perspective.
Yes, 100%. You just reminded me of something I wasn't going to speak about, but I mentioned it already in Lubavitcher Rebbe's memoirs, where it's called Sefer Zichronis, which was written by the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe we just last week I spoke about his passing, which we commemorated last week. So he wrote this book, and what it goes on, it's actually a story of the background to the birth of the Hasidic movement. And it spoke about these people that were the pioneers to the Hasidic movement before it formally became the Hasidic movement. So it was even prior to the Baal Shem Tov. But interestingly enough, he talks about the Alter Rebbe's grandparents, those stories that I just said, the grandmothers. Is for some reason there's a lot of discussion about women studying Torah. And he talks about another lady, I can't remember the details of her, how she actually had lost children, and she got remarried, and she moved to this big Jewish town where Torah study was like on the decline, and she reinvented, like rebuilt the entire Torah system in this town. Incredible story. And it was all through this woman. She started classes for women, and then she encouraged her husband, her second husband, who was a big Torah scholar and a very wealthy man, to start building yeshivot and to start giving classes as well. And literally the entire, and I'm trying to remember which town it is. It's a very famous Jewish town. It's just can't remember right now. She ends up being literally responsible for one of the greatest Torah centers in Jewish history. This one woman, and then he writes about, once again, one of these leaders to the Jewish, the Hasidic folk. You know, the Daf Yomi cycle was started by Reb Meir Shapiro, who was the Rav of Lublin, and we're told that his one of the stories behind his greatness was definitely all great scholars were their mothers, but with him it's more obvious. At once he was moving or something like that, or there was a fire or something happened, and he couldn't go to his cheder that day, and his mother was crying, and she said to his mother, why are you crying? Are you crying because our house has burnt down? And she says, no, my son, I'm not crying because the house burnt down. I'm crying because you missed a day in cheder. You missed a day in Torah study. You could imagine the type of impression that would have had on this little boy, and he grows up to be one of the great scholars of our time, and he initiated the Daf Yomi, which is the cycle where they go through the whole Talmud over 7 years. Okay, but let's go back to the text for a moment. I got a little bit carried away with this idea, but I want to just share a few other thoughts on this concept, the Torah reading. So we spoke about the fact that the women come first. Why? Because the way that women study, or the importance of them to study, in a way surpasses that of the men. By the way, there's two reasons for this. There's lots of things that women have less time-bound obligations. Why? Because women's souls, from a Kabbalistic perspective, they come from a point where they don't need this constant inspiration to be re-inspired. They don't have to every day put on for them. They don't have an obligation to do Shema twice. Why? Because it's believed, according to Kabbalah, that they have this deeper connection, that they don't have to reinvent that connection every day. But men, to a certain degree, do. And that's why if men weren't obligated, then they would not do it. But women, even without being obligated, they do it. We're told and I want to just take this point a bit further. There's a line that says that when Mashiach comes, mitzvot betelot la'ased lavo. That when Mashiach comes, the mitzvahs will be nullified. We'll stop having mitzvot. So there's another pasuk, there's another teaching that says, the Rambam teaches us, that nothing's going to change. All the mitzvahs will stay. Not only that, we'll have the completion. We'll be able to do all the mitzvahs that we haven't been able to do during our time in exile. So how could you say that the mitzvahs are nullified? So the answer is that the concept of a mitzvah, what's the meaning of a mitzvah? It's a command. We connect to Hashem through the command of the mitzvah. The answer is that why are we doing the mitzvahs now? Because God commands us. What are the mitzvahs? They're God's will. He's commanding us to fulfill His will. But when Mashiach comes, we will do the mitzvahs not because we're commanded to do it, just because we are in tune with it, because it's one with us. We won't have to be told to do it. We'll just do it. It's like a child, you got to make rules and tell them to do this and that. But then they grow up and you're hoping you don't have to start commanding them to brush their teeth or to commanding them to do things. You hope that they understand to do it themselves. The same thing's going to happen with Mashiach. So to a certain degree, we can say that the woman not being obligated in the concept of Torah study is because they don't need that obligation. By then, the concept of Torah study is not because they're obligated, it's because they want to. And that's the concept that we're all trying to strive towards. So, there was another point that we were going to mention over here, where we see that if you look in Rashi, he says there's a difference in the wording. Hey Raina, welcome. It says over here, Kotomar. This is what you should say when you look in the verse about the Torah. Say to the Bet Yaakov, who we've already explained to be the woman, it says Tomar. And when it says to Bnei Yisrael, it says Taged. What's Tomar and Taged? Look in Rashi. He says Tomar is in this language. But he says Belashon, Tomar lahem Belashon raka, in a gentle language. But with men, it says Dvarim kashim kegidim. You have to say Taged. Taged is in a harsh tone. Why? It says, once again, men need to have a stronger warning about giving the Torah. But also the woman, if you're going to tell them about the punishments or the laws, that's not what's going to get them excited about Torah study. What's going to excite the woman is when you tell them about the blessings and the promises and the goodness of the Torah. And also, what do you want them to give over to the children? When they're going to be teaching their children, you don't want them to be telling them, oh, if you don't do this, you'll get this punishment and you're going to die in hell or whatever it is. You don't want to scare children into keeping Torah. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to get them to love the Torah. So when women are educating children, they should be doing it in a way of love. Okay, so that's the second point that I wanted to bring out. So we're talking about today, it's 53 minutes into our class, but we're talking about today the preparations for receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. So this is obviously extremely relevant to us. We as Jewish people need to know what was important. Why did the Torah tell us about certain things had to happen or happened just before the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai? So what are the things that occur before the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai? There's the exile, the slavery in Egypt, which is of course important. The slavery in Egypt. There's the redemption. And in order for the Jewish people to be able to receive the Torah, they have to have gone through this concept of being slaves and then being freed. Because through that they become people that, first of all, we appreciate our freedom, but also become God's people. And then we get to see all those miracles and believe in Hashem in a much deeper way. And then we needed to have the splitting of the sea. Now, last week I spoke about why the splitting of the sea was such an integral part of Jewish history, and why it almost changes and is an ultimate preparation to the giving of the Torah, what it means to be a Jew, by revealing the hidden secrets of the world. We mentioned last week how the sea represents everything that is concealed. In order to receive the Torah, they needed that preparation, to recognize that everything in the world is just a facade, and there's a lot more going on. There's a lot of divinity going on. That was last week's discussion. I don't want to get into that. But this week's discussion, we spoke about that in order to receive the Torah, we have to acknowledge that the woman, in a certain sense, needed to receive the Torah first, or needed to be told in one particular way, and to prepare. But there's two other preparations that occur before this, which I was hoping to have more time to focus in, but I wanted to touch on them at least. Preparation number one, the portion is called the portion of Yitro. So let me just show you this to you on the screen for a moment. Oh, it's not opening. Sorry. It's not. Oh, there you go. See, it's just being a bit slow. Okay. So our portion this week is going to start about Yisro arriving with Moshe's children and all the people. And look what it says. Moshe tells his father-in-law everything that occurred in Egypt, what happened to Jewish people, that they got freed, what happened. And Yisro becomes very happy. It says, Vayomer Vayichad Yisrael was happy that that the Jewish people were saved. Now here's the really important line. He says like this: Ataya daiti ki gadol Hashem mikol elihim ki vadavar asher zadu alihem. He says, now I know that God is greater than all other gods. In order for the Jewish people to receive the Torah, the truth is that this actually, historically, this episode actually occurs after the Torah, the giving of the Torah. Yisrael arrives after the giving of the Torah, as far as we understand. But we're told about it beforehand. Why are we told about it? Because of this line. The line is that in order to receive the Torah, we have to come to an acknowledgement that God is greater than anything, than all other belief systems, the belief in the Torah, the belief in the Jewish God. And who better than Yisro to do it? Why? Because we're told that Yisro was the one individual who was like the greatest philosopher, scholar, wisest man. He had tried every religion at the time. And at the end he said, now I'm certain that God is greater than all other gods. How do we know that? Because look at his words. His word says, Ata, now Yadaiti, I know, Ki Gadol Hashem. Yud Kei Vav Kei refers to the Jewish God. The ultimate Hashem is greater Mikol Elokim. How did he know that? How could we repeat that in the Torah? That is greater than all other gods. So we understand from that, and we already understood previously in Parashat Shemot, when we were first revealed to him, that this was a man of tremendous power, great influence. We know that he was a advisor to Pharaoh back in Egypt. So this was a man that really knew everything. He'd been there and done it, literally every single religion. And now he was the one that says, okay, now I see that Judaism is definitely the right one. So it's not about Judaism, it's about, once again, when we're going to see the Torah is not there that everyone has to start keeping the Torah. But the Torah does expect everyone to believe in God, no matter whether you're Jewish or not. Well, one of the 7 Noahide laws, by the way, the obligation for the people to believe in the Torah to believe in a God. It started by the Noahide laws, but today's day and age we do it not because of Noahide laws, but because of the fact that God gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai. In other words, if somebody says, I believe in God, they're only truly fulfilled the obligation of fulfilling the 7 Noahide laws if they said, I believe in God because God told me to do it on Mount Sinai. So, in other words, by the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, just like Yisro acknowledges that God on Mount Sinai as a preparation for Mount Sinai, this concept starts to refer to all people. Mount Sinai was not just for Jews. We received all the 630 mitzvahs. But the 7 Noahide laws becomes the responsibility of all people from the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Okay, I wanted to talk about that more, but I wanted to talk about one other point as a preparation. So what's this preparation? This preparation, Hasidic terms, it's a lot deeper, which we don't have time to get into. The other major preparation for Torah study, so the one is acknowledging godliness and spirituality in the world, how God created the world and he's the one in charge of the world. And the other one is this one. And this is what I would say is the ultimate purpose of the Torah. It says, where am I going? This one, the second verse. It says the Jewish people came to the desert, Sinai desert, and they parked themselves in the Midbar. Says that Vayichan Sham Yisrael Negrahar. And he dwelt there opposite the mountain. Says Rashi, this is one considered extremely important point. Vayichan Sham, says Rashi, Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. It says it is singular. Why? It just spoke in plural. That they dwelt. Now it's saying and he dwelt. Why is it telling us when they arrived on Mount Sinai, in order to receive the Torah, suddenly there was this absolute unity. He says, Aval shar kol achoniyot b'tarumut v'machloked. Every other time people traveled, there was always arguments and debates. But when it came to receiving the Torah, there was absolute unity. That it was considered like a singular individual. And the lesson was that if we want to be able to study the Torah, we have to be able to become united with other people. We have to be able to see things from other people's perspective. How do they do this? So we're told because they were neged ahar. They had one purpose at that time. When they realized at that moment that we are here for one mission, one purpose. Yeah, this guy may have stolen something from me, and that guy may have called me a name, and that guy may have done something wrong to me. That's all true. But that's the smaller picture, so to speak. When they focused out and when they were able to come to Mount Sinai, then everything else was forgotten. And they realized that it's all for one thing. It's to be neged ahar. What's neged ahar? Opposite the mountain. They were facing Mount Sinai. They saw this is where the Torah is going to be given. And everything became clear to them. And therefore, when that happened, all their side distractions fell away. And they were able to focus on the ultimate purpose of creation, why they were there, to receive the Torah and to connect to God. This is extremely important because when we recognize that almost all of our arguments and fights are there as a distraction from the truth, a distraction from the ultimate purpose of why were we created and what we were trying to achieve, we would realize that most of our fights are not about things that we really want to be fighting about or that really matter to us. Because when it comes to the most important matters, which is neged ahar, about being together, about connecting with each other, those are much more important. When we were to do that, most of our fights would fall away. And that's the only preparation for the Torah. If Torah is about our own egos, about who can boost and who could, if Torah has anything to do with anything but humility, but acceptance, and being open and reflective of the others, then we would have no chance of actually growing in our Torah knowledge and study. But because it isn't, we have that ability. Okay, so that's what I would like to conclude with tonight, as in what are the important preparations for receiving the Torah. Well, what we consider the important ones. Number one, I spoke about understanding that women have an essential role within Torah study, which is in a way more important than the role of the man. The man has the obligatory part, that for himself he has to study the Torah, and he has an obligation to study Torah twice a day, and he has an obligation to teach his children. That's his obligation. But a woman has, in a way, a far deeper, that they have to know Torah and live with Torah so well that their whole entire house has an ambience of Torah. It's so important that it can't even be tied down to a specific time and place. And number two is, I mentioned about how Yisro acknowledges that God is the greater than all other religions, that the ultimate preparation of the Jewish people was an acknowledgement of God and the truth of what we believe. And finally, in order for us to be able to receive the Torah, and today to study the Torah, to be truly students of the Torah, we require humility and unity. And through that, we'd be able to have a far greater connection to the Torah.
Okay. Rabbi, on the topic of unity, I just realized something. I don't know if it's backed up in the literature, but so it talks about neged ahar, the expression there, but back in Bereshis talk about Eze Kenegdoi. It's a similar phrasing about Eva's created as people translate as companion, support to Adam, but as a Kenegdoi, it's the same sort of phrasing. Is it maybe hints at the unity there, the unity of purpose?
That's an interesting one. It's an interesting connection, possible connection. I like it. whether it's sourced somewhere else or not, I like the idea. Thank you. Shkoyach. Yeah. Any other questions or points? People want to argue about something like Kasap or any other
Argument?
Yeah. Anything.
All right.
By the way,
I got-
you know that I didn't get into this, but the Jewish people, it says that in the okay. Ask your question and then I'll get to my.
No, I think I changed my mind. I think I may have changed my mind.
Okay, but
All
arguing in Torah study, we believe that arguing is actually a way of deepening our understanding when it comes to Torah study, and that's why you see in the very first Mishnah of the Talmud, there's lots and lots of arguments. It's a three-way argument going on over there, two-way argument, bunch of arguments, and throughout the Mishnah there's always arguments, but it finishes the whole of the Mishnah concludes with Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom. These arguments actually add peace to the world. If we don't allow debate, then how are you ever going to get to peace? Then what is it? It's a dictatorship when there's no debate.
Very good.
But Judaism is replete with arguments and discussion because that's what creates the clarity. So when we talk about unity, it doesn't mean conformitism. It doesn't mean a lack of ability to question and to ask questions. On the opposite, you will not find any texts, ancient texts for sure, and probably even modern texts that are as full with debates and arguments and questions as the Talmud and Jewish study. It's replete with that. That's what it's based on.
There's an interesting sociological observation that when we look at who we argue with most intensely, the closer someone is to us, usually like family, that's the people you argue most with because that's who you're most comfortable with. So the unity, the closer you are with someone, normally the more secure the relationship, the more comfortable you are to relax and have a really good argument, knowing that the relationship, the connection will survive the argument.
That's true. There's truth to that. And also sometimes another idea is that, and we should remember that when we argue with our spouses or our loved ones in general, instead of looking at it, why do they have to always argue? Why do they have to always get at me? Sometimes we argue with that person because those are the people that we actually care about. So when something's important, it's worth arguing about. And when Mr. Joe Schmo, not Joe Stosser, but another Joe Schmo somewhere else, says they have a particular opinion which you disagree about, and you could fundamentally disagree about, it probably doesn't bother you that much. But when it's your family, it's when you're loved on, it bothers you a lot more. And therefore, instead of saying, why that person have to acknowledge or be aware that it's coming from a place of love, both the recipient of the disagreement and the one who's disagreeing as well, be aware where it's coming from. So if you're arguing with your wife, for example, ideally we should make sure that it's clear that that argument, that disagreement is coming from a place of love and doesn't come from an accusing place. Unfortunately, that's where we get it wrong. But when we argue in a way that we're just trying to get a better understanding, it could be much better. I'm not saying that, by the way. I do agree that sometimes we should just give in, and sometimes marriage is about giving in and what's the right word that I'm looking for? Compromise, sacrifice a bit. If there's no compromise, no sacrifice, there's no none of that, then argument as well isn't good. There has to be the right balance. But the truth is that the point that I was going to say to Noach is that the Hasidus has a great emphasis on the fact that the Torah was specifically given in the third month, not in the first, not in the second, but in the third. Why in the third? The first represents oneness. It's like conformity. There's just one. But there's only one true one. That's God. When the Jewish people left Egypt, that was in the first month. That was just clear. They just saw God, and that was it. There was the splitting of the sea. There was the great miracles. There was the Exodus. It was all about God. There was no questioning. When they came to the second month, the second day of creation, for example, is about division. It's about two sides. The Torah has, and then the Torah is given when? In the third month. Why the third month? B'chodesh HaShlishi. What does it say? The third month. Because when you have two sides, just two sides, that's not good. But the third side has to have an ultimate objective. That's the number 3. 3 is also unity. Unity which is created through debate, through division, but ultimately a deeper understanding. So if you have just one, then there was never space for difference, there was never space for argument, and therefore it's just conformity, it's just oneness. That's the pure oneness of Hashem. When you have just two, it remains divided. That's why in the second day of creation, when we separate, when we divide the upper world from the lower world, it doesn't say kitov, it doesn't say twice that it's good, because it's just division, separation between holiness, between spiritual and physical. But then when the Torah is given on Mount Sinai, it says God descends. He rectifies that division that took place on the second day of creation. On the third day of creation, when God creates dry land, then he creates the opportunity for man to connect with the divine. Now that's incredible. That's not just God shining. That's the Torah's objective, was that we should be able to create and see the two sides and come together. As the Torah says, "Vayavo hashlishi vayachre b'neim." You have two things that are debating with each other, but you have a third pasuk or third perspective that ultimately is deciding. So if our three is the number of two different sides, but ultimately coming together. So that's why that's the Torah. Everything in the Torah is 3, right? There's 3 books of the Torah. There's Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. There's the 3 circles, God, the Jewish people, and the Torah. There's a lot that has to do with 3. Why? Because 3 is that ability to connect. And that's true unity. True unity is when you have those opposites, but they come together. That's what it's all about.
We call it a unity, not a trinity. Very good.
Trinity is not good. I like that.
Yes.
But yeah, no,
Funny.
Trinity is certainly not a Jewish belief. So
Yes.
don't get confused with that type of Trinity. Yeah, no.
Yeah. No, I didn't have any problem with arguments. I was saying, you're asking before if anyone had a comment or an argument, so I was going to bring an argument, but then I changed my mind.
So that's why I was saying an argument is good. I know you were.
Yeah. But
There's nothing wrong with it. As I said, there's nothing wrong with the argument in Jewish discussion.
So maybe just quickly, I will ask.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Just quickly. So the day before Matan Torah was the biggest example of disunity with the Egel. With the Egel Hazav.
That happened 40 days later.
Egel Hazav.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
The Egel Hazav.
So my thought was all wrong. Okay.
Yeah, the Egel Hazav happens. What happens is Moshe Rabbeinu with the Torah. We read about it in 2 weeks' time. We're going to read about it. Moshe Rabbeinu, he goes up to receive the Torah. Parshat Ki Tisa. Or maybe it's even 3 parshas. What are we up to? 3 weeks. Truma Tisa Ki Tisa. In Parshat Ki Tisa, what happens is when you don't see this, but it revisits them. It first gives us a bunch of laws of the tabernacle and things like that. And there's a whole reason of why it does it, which is very actually connected to our discussion, but I don't want to get into it now. But just to give clarity, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, and the Jewish people, he had the 10 Commandments. Before he goes up, he says, "I will be back in 40 days' time."
Yes.
He never comes back down between them.
Yeah.
It's
No,
So Moshe, when he goes up on those 40 days, he stays up there, and then on the 40th day he returns with the Jewish people serving the golden calf.
That's right. So that I had the timing wrong with the third month. But so where I was coming from is that we had to be in absolute unity before receiving the Torah. When one day before Moshe came down, we were in disunity. That's where I was coming from. Where I was coming from.
Hmm.
Not necessarily the third month,
Yeah.
but the very day before we received the Torah, we were in absolute disarray, not in unity.
Hold on. Does the question still remain?
Well, if we had to be in absolute unity in order to receive the Torah, yes, it does remain.
Well,
If
hold
it's
on.
regarding the third month, no. But if it's in order to receive the Torah, we had to be in absolute unity. Well, then the
They
very
were
day
in
before.
absolute unity. That's what the Torah says. V'yichin sham. It tells us they were in unity. So where do you get that they weren't in unity? I'm not understanding. Where
With the Egel HaZahav, that's what I'm saying. It came down with the Luchot.
but that was 40 days later.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. If it's a matter of the third month, then I'm wrong. But if it's to the point.
Okay. Now I understand what you're saying. Okay, I understand what you're saying. You're saying that Moshe comes down 40 days later. Okay, now I understand your question. He comes down 40 days later with the Luchot. And the Jewish people are not in unity. They're busy serving the golden calf.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's an interesting question. Or what I'd say to that is that the Torah only tells us about one time that there was the giving of the Torah. That was on the sixth day of Sivan, when Moshe first goes up to Mount Sinai and they had the 10 Commandments. 40 days later, they weren't going to receive the Torah. They're going to receive the Luchot, the tablets. The Torah that's itself they would be receiving, it started from that day when Moshe went up to Mount Sinai, but it was going to be continuous. So for the actual giving of the Torah, so to speak, well, we just call a mountain going up to Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah that they received, not the written document, but that they received really only at the beginning. And as you know, that when Moshe 40 days later Moshe comes down and they have this craziness and they're serving this idol, Moshe does drop the luchot. There isn't that concept, and they're not a receptacle at that moment to receive the luchot until they repair that. But the actual moment of the first announcement of the 10 Commandments, which we today celebrate as Shavuot, and the giving of the Torah, even though at that point it was only in a very cryptic mode of 10 Commandments. But for that moment there was unity, 100%. Absolute unity.
Shkoyach.
Interesting question. But anyway, we will, and we have in the past discussed that, but maybe when we get to the episode of the Golden Calf in a few weeks' time, maybe we'll revisit your question.
Yeah, well, you answered my question. I actually accepted it. It's a good answer.
So Noah, in IT terms, it's the difference between download and streaming.
Yeah, almost. Yes. No, good answer. Good answer. That's good. That's fair enough. Because I received the Torah before the Luchot. So yeah.
Right.
Shkoyach. Good one.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good show.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.
Good to see you, Yochanan.
Good night, Irene.
Yes.
Joe, thank you, everybody.